we are live from the traditional territory of the Huu-ay-aht First Nation. So we have a really special episode today. We've teamed up, and it's not only the BMSC live team, but also the BMSC Climate Action Series bringing you the lesson. And we have a number of guest speakers as well who will be helping out. So my name is Kelly. I'm one of the educators at the Bamfield Marine Sciences Center, but I'm going to introduce you to our team here in just a moment because there's quite a number of people involved in this lesson, today's show, and so we really are excited to have so many different guest speakers helping out today. On board the boat with me here today, we have myself, and I'm just gonna switch my camera around here. We have Aneri. There she is. So she's the host of the BMSC Climate Action Series. So Aneri's on board. We have Owen, who is our ROV driver extraordinaire. And so Owen's just going to display the ROV for you. We're going to get this guy into the water here momentarily to begin exploring one of the neatest and most exciting but underappreciated ecosystems that you often find around the British Columbia coastline. So we'll be using the ROV in just a moment to go explore a kelp forest, and the kelp forest is just in the background here behind Owen, closer to the island here, and we'll get up close and personal so that you can actually discover all about the kelp forest and what they are doing for the planet. The final member on board the boat here is Phil. He is our tech hand, and I just want to take a moment to show you Phil's setup back here because this is wild. He has all this technology set up right here on the boat in order to bring you this lesson today. So he's got a lot going on back here, and we're just going to switch to Phil momentarily so that he can give you an introduction to where we are.
Hi everyone, welcome to our show. So let's just get going there. Oh, I see a hello from Cascadia Seaweed in Sydney, BC. Leanna's over on the Sunshine Coast. That's cool. Yeah, let us know from where you're viewing. I'm checking here. Hopefully we have some viewers on YouTube as well. We'll get to you guys eventually too. Checking out our chat. So let us know from where you are viewing. And just to show you where we are, let's do a little screen share. Oh, someone from Rossland. All right. Everyone wants to know where is Bamfield, and we have just show you here. So pulling up Google Earth, you can actually see, so Bamfield, we are on the west side of Vancouver Island. West side of Vancouver Island, on very small town. Actually, it's, yes, so it's, as Kelly mentioned, located within the traditional territory of the Huu-ay-aht First Nation. And typically we do our shows from the Bamfield Marine Science Center. So here's Bamfield right there. And today we actually hopped in our boat and head out across Trevor Channel right here over to what's called Satellite Pass. And that is where the show is coming from you live today. So bringing all the technology together, we're able to send you our signal and hope you enjoy the show.
Wow. I am loving seeing all of the different places popping up on the screen of where everyone's viewing from. We have viewers from, it looks like all over the world right now. So this is so exciting. I'd like to take this moment to introduce our first guest speaker of today. And that is Dr. Patrick Martone from the University of British Columbia. So Patrick is joining us from the Bamfield Marine Sciences Center campus today, not far from where the boat is situated. And Patrick is one of the professors who is teaching the seaweed course at BMSC as part of our fall program university courses. So Patrick, go ahead and unmute yourself, and you can tell us a little bit about yourself as we get the ROV situated in the right spot.
Sounds good. Hello, everybody. Thanks, Kelly. So yeah, I'm a professor at UBC, and I've been studying seaweed biology for about 20 years now, mostly along the west coast of North America. And the work in my lab we think about the physiology of seaweeds, the ecology of seaweeds, and mostly how it is that they manage, intertidal seaweeds manage to live in a really stressful environment. But we also think about seaweed biodiversity. And I have a part of my lab that's describing new species from our coast and just helping educate the world about all the different diverse seaweeds that we have out here. And in my work at Bamfield and others, I've created a little app called the Seaweed Sorter, which can help local people determine and identify about 115 different species that we have on our coast. So if you're interested in learning more about all the different wonderful seaweeds we have, check it out, the Seaweed Sorter. Yeah, so I'm excited to see what Owen's going to find in this ROV today. And this will be exciting. I get to go on a dive even from the comfort of this office. So this is cool.
This is a lot of fun. And this is the beauty of, for everybody who's joining from any other part of the world, we have this ROV that can take you literally underwater. And so that's what we're going to spend the first part of our lesson doing. So I'll just share with you what Owen and Aneri are up to so that you can see from the boat. They've got the ROV deployed into the water and it's heading over towards shore. And now from here on the boat, I know that doesn't really look like much. So it's just rocks and there's the waves crashing against the rocks there. But all along that shoreline, lining the coast, is this really, really important ecosystem, which is a kelp forest. And from the surface, we don't see that much of it. But with the ROV, we can actually take a closer look at what's happening under the water. And so let's switch to our ROV feed now and start to explore a little bit underwater. So I'll ask Phil to spotlight. There it is. This is live underwater in the kelp forest here in Barkley Sound. We are so excited to be able to share this with you live as we go along, and we can just kind of drive around and explore what's down there and learn a little bit about the kelp itself. So maybe Dr. Martone, maybe we can start with just a simple question of what is kelp and how does it is it different than seaweed? What are we looking at here?
That's a good question. So kelps are a very special kind of seaweed. Seaweed usually refers to any macroscopic, so multicellular, big alga. So algae is kind of the big umbrella, which includes phytoplankton, which are little tiny things, and seaweeds, which are the big things. And so kelp are a special kind of seaweed. So they're a kind of a subset of the seaweed. We have 3 different big groups of seaweed on our coast. We have green algae and red algae and brown algae. And so the kelp are a special kind of brown algae. And the lovely thing about kelp is that they're often big, right? They're the ones that catch your eye. They're the ones that really form this enormous habitat. And they provide food and habitat for a lot of the animals that we see. They also, they slow down. 2 things that I'm noticing in this image is that they can really block out a lot of the light. I think you should notice that at the bottom of a kelp forest can be quite a bit darker. Oh, I see a kelp crab hanging out on there that Owen found. So there's a crab that lives in the canopy of the giant kelp. And they also slow the water moving. Water movement through a kelp forest is a lot slower. And so that makes it more accessible and, habitable for the animals. So they're not whipping by in all the fast moving water. The kelp is mainly sort of a more stable environment.
And it's called a kelp forest. Is it sort of comparable to a terrestrial forest on land?
Yeah, the kelp forest can support all kinds of life. There's lots of animals, invertebrates like sponges and anemones and tunicates and crabs and all of those, but also vertebrates, right? You see the fish swimming by, lots of rockfish, and other fish can use this as habitat. And so because of all that, this is often where you'll find other larger mammals and things hanging out as well. So the forest provides this, the kelp forest can provide a really dense structure for a lot of animals to live there. And when you don't have the kelp, you generally don't have as much diversity of other organisms.
Wow. And so what is the primary species of kelp that we're looking at here today so far?
The ones that I'm seeing mostly in view are called Macrocystis. This is the giant kelp, Macrocystis pyrifera. And that's probably, well, it's one of the two main forest forming kelps that we have in this part of the world. The other one being bull kelp. So what you're seeing here is the giant kelp, which has many different blades along the stipe. And at the base of every blade, you can't see it right here, but they have little floats. And this is something that's kind of remarkable about these kelps, is that some of them, we think about plants on land to grow upright. They have to create these woody structures like trunks, big tree trunks and stems. And that's how they grow up in air. Because air isn't very dense. So they have to make this really rigid structure. But living in water, these kelps have another trick, which is that they don't have to build woody structures necessarily. They can just inflate little, almost like little balloons that will naturally rise towards the surface. And so they're able to be, many, 20, 30 meters long, simply by having these little floats, which are floating the blades up to the water surface to photosynthesize. So the stipes are very skinny, which lets them kind of move with the water, but having those extra little floats can let them be really, really tall. And the other species that we don't see here, sorry, Kelly, just the other one is the bull kelp that maybe we'll see later. But the bull kelp that everyone probably knows is the one that looks like a really long snake. You often see it washed up on the beach, and it has all of its blades at the end. It has kind of like a float and then a bunch of blades at the end. So those are the two main really big forest forming kelps that we have here.
Awesome. Yeah, hopefully we can find some bull kelp for you as well for comparison. I wonder if Owen is able to drive the ROV close enough so that we can see some of those floats as part of the kelp, but I'm also noticing from this footage that it looks that it's pretty swelly out here today. And by that, I mean that there's a lot of wave action moving against the shore. So where Owen's driven the ROV in closer to the rocks, there's quite a bit of current and turbulence underwater, and you can see those seaweeds kind of thrashing around in the waves. The other thing that I'm noticing is that the water is fairly murky today. And this is normal for this time of year. So we're just, I guess this is the first day of fall now. However, we are still kind of in a warmer summertime season, and often we get a lot of plankton in the water. Some plankton are actually tiny bits of algae as well, much smaller than these large kelps that we're seeing. And some plankton are zooplankton, small animals, but they are interfering a little bit with our visibility underwater today, and that's just normal for this time of year. If we did this lesson in December, we'd probably have nice clear water, less plankton in the water, but we'd also probably have more waves and ugly weather in December. So we'll take it the way we get it today.
Yeah, it looks like
so
Owen is seeing those nematocysts. Yeah.
Yeah. So those are the floats that help the kelp to float up towards the surface and spread the blades or the leaves out for better photosynthesis. Great. This is awesome, you guys. So for our audience that's watching at home, this is a great chance if you have any questions about the kelp or questions for Dr. Martone, you can type them into the chat and we are happy to answer as we go along. And I do believe there was an earlier question that appeared in the Q&A from somebody who was wondering if it's still possible to harvest seaweed sustainably from the wild, or if we should only be relying on aquaculture for kelp harvesting.
That's a very good question, and I think that's something that we're giving a lot of thought to these days. Some of these, I'm kind of curious what that is.
Oh, and can you pause on what you're looking at there? Patrick wants to know what we've got here.
just can't quite tell. It looks like it might be something called, I can't tell if that's Desmorestia. Yeah, that's what Liam says too in the chat. Desmorestia is another brown alga that often lives at the base of some of these kelps. And cool thing about Desmorestia is that it has sulfuric acid inside of it. So when an urchin or another animal takes a little bite of the Desmorestia, they get a mouthful of acid. So it's thought to be an herbivore deterrent because, you know, no one wants to get a mouthful of acid. And especially those animals with calcified mouth parts. Oh yeah, and you see, we just saw some urchins down there. I see Owen found some urchins. And
oh, and we saw a glimpse of an urchin.
yeah. He's doing a great job keeping the camera steady, actually. I can see. Yeah, there's some urchins down there. Yeah, so they're, you know, they're trying to munch down any seaweed they get to. And if you notice all around those urchins, one of the things you see are the pink blotches. It looks like someone's smeared bubble gum on the rock down there. Those are coralline algae, which are red seaweeds, which are calcified. So those calcified pink, red seaweeds, they resist those urchin grazers because the urchins are going to eat everything they come in contact with. So when the urchins are really abundant, you often see them associated with these pink crusts because those are the ones that survive. That's another kind of seaweed. It doesn't look like a seaweed, but it photosynthesizes and it's just another form of seaweed that grows like a crust. Looks kind of like a rock, like a pink rock. Back to the question about the harvesting wild seaweeds. You know, all of these seaweeds, we have to be careful when we think about how they grow. I'm back. I was just saying that seaweeds grow different. We have to know the seaweed that you're collecting to know where it grows. And usually a sustainable harvest would preserve the growing part of the seaweed. That way you could remove part of it and then maybe the rest would regrow. So in some parts of the world, there are laws that tell you how to collect seaweed sustainably. But, you know, we're still learning a lot about their reproduction and their performance as ocean conditions change, and thinking about how many can we sustainably remove and allow the populations to persist. So that's a really great ongoing conversation in the community.
Great. I think there were some other questions coming through the chat that actually I've missed now. So I might call upon Phil to help relay some of those questions back to me again.
Sure. Over in the Q&A, we can go through these. There's 3 in the Q&A right now. How many species of Macrocystis are there?
That's a fun question. So first I'll tell you that on our coast, we probably have somewhere around maybe 500 species of seaweeds, 500 to 600. This is, I'm waving my arms around, you know, it's hard to say, but we have hundreds of species. But when you're talking about the giant kelp, there is only one species, and it is in fact only one species worldwide. And what's really cool, you can find Macrocystis in other parts of the world. Like in Chile, for example, you can find giant kelp down in Chile. And because it floats, that single species has been able to float around the world and drop its spores and propagate. So while in some groups we know that we have lots of species, the giant kelp has been really successful in colonizing different parts of the world, but it's all just one species. Good question.
Yeah, thanks. That was from Jocelyn. And so a few more coming in, a couple that speak to carbon sequestration. Carl's asking, curious if you could comment on the relative contribution of kelp forest to carbon sequestration as compared with other forms of cold water algae.
This is a good question. There's a lot of research in this area right now. And I will say that some of these kelps, like the bull kelp, for example, which is the one that we're not seeing, but the one that has kind of the long stipe, that thing grows very, very fast. The blades of the bull kelp can grow up, say, 6 to 10 centimeters per day. So very, very fast growth. So you can imagine that it's pulling out a lot of carbon out of the oceans as it's growing. The one tricky thing about carbon sequestration, and this is something that people are really thinking about these days, is that you have to get the carbon into a place that will not be immediately eaten. Because if a kelp might be sequestering lots of carbon, but if that just gets eaten by a bunch of invertebrates and snails and things, then all that carbon is just going to be recycled back into the food web and then back into the environment. So that's, in some ways, that's the trick. Sometimes kelp can get washed into the deep ocean and then be mostly out of contact with the herbivores, but that is not always the case. So there's a lot of more work that needs to be done on really understanding the not just the carbon sequestration, but how to basically permanently get the carbon out of the food web, at least for a few hundred to 1,000 years, something like that.
Great. Thanks for that, Carl. And along the same topic, Elizabeth is asking, do we know whether different seaweeds, such as brown, green, or red, sequester carbon at different rates?
These are all good questions. My gut, the answer is I don't know. That's the answer. I will say that kelps are probably the ones to really be looking at because they grow so fast and they can be so huge and abundant. The ones that I think are interesting are some of those coralline reds, which I mentioned before. These are the calcified reds because they're taking carbon and sticking into calcium carbonate. And calcium carbonate is basically limestone. So these are little red algae made of limestone. And very few animals eat that limestone. And that's a very stable place to store carbon. So I'm really interested in the effect of those calcified seaweeds on carbon sequestration. The downside of those is that they grow very, very slowly. So they're kind of the slow growth that can permanently lock in the carbon, whereas the kelps grow really quickly, but they might get eaten. I love seeing all the fish in the canopy.
Yeah, this is a beautiful shot with all of the fish and the crabs clinging onto the kelp. So this has given all our viewers a really good chance to appreciate what the kelp forest actually looks like underwater. Although we want to take some time to actually visit some of the other researchers who are doing kelp studies in Barkley Sound and around the Bamfield Marine Sciences Center. And so I think for now we will transition back to the lab where we have an interview happening with Dr. Sam Starko. And Sam is a researcher who's been coming out to Bamfield for many years. And so I think we'll turn it over to Sam.
Hi folks, we hope you enjoyed the kelp discovery portion of today's webinar with the BMSC live team. And don't worry if you have any burning kelp questions that didn't get answered, we may get to it in the next portion of the episode. Now that you've had the chance to see a kelp forest ecosystem underwater, we're going to hear from a couple of the scientists who study kelp and who are trying to understand how they are responding to the effects of the climate crisis and starting to research how we can restore these important ecosystems. First up is Dr. Samuel Starko, a postdoctoral fellow working with Dr. Julia Baum at the University of Victoria. His current work studies how broad-scale disturbances like heat waves and fine-scale disturbances like overfishing and pollution interact and influence coastal ecosystems like coral reefs and kelp forests. Sam uses techniques in molecular biology, biomechanics, and field ecology to understand how environmental factors affect kelp, knowledge from which is used to understand their basic ecology and inform conservation efforts. Prior to his postdoc, Sam completed his PhD at the University of British Columbia, working with our very own Dr. Patrick Martone, who you just heard from. All right, let's get back on a boat and take you out to another kelp forest ecosystem with Sam. Sam, you study kelp. What got you interested in studying kelp?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think I've always sort of been interested in plants, and I've always been extremely passionate and interested in the ocean, and so it was just right where those two things sort of met. I think kelp are really interesting because they produce all of this habitat that a lot of other species rely on, and we also live here in British Columbia. We live in one of the diversity hotspots for kelp, so we have a lot of different species to learn a lot about.
Neat. So, basic question.
Yes.
Is kelp a plant?
Yeah, so that really depends on how you define the term plant. So it's not a plant in the sense of like a fern or a tree. It's a totally different group of organisms, but functionally it acts the same way as a plant in that it's photosynthesizing. It's basically pulling carbon dioxide out of the water, out of the water and producing sugars.
Cool.
Much in the same way that plants do.
So you said that BC is a hotspot for kelp biodiversity.
Yeah.
How many different species of kelp are there?
In the world or in British Columbia?
Both.
Okay, so in the world there's, it sort of depends on how, what your cutoff is for a species, but somewhere upwards of about 120 to 130 species of kelp worldwide. And then in British Columbia we have just under 25 species, but here in in Barclay Sound we can reliably find about 16 or 17 of them.
Wow.
Yeah, so pretty diverse.
And are there any species that are sort of doing better or worse with the effects of climate change?
Yeah, definitely. So some of the species, what we found is that some species that are growing in really wave-exposed areas tend to be doing pretty well because those wave-exposed areas are really well mixed and they stay cool. And even if you have a hot, low tide, they're getting splashed by waves. But some of these species that specialize in more sheltered areas might be hit a little bit harder because, if they're living in the intertidal and there's no waves to splash them and the water's warming up and there's not that same level of mixing, then those species tend to not do as well, or those populations at least.
So with the recent heat waves that's been happening and likely to continue even more in the future, what are your concerns, or do you have any?
Yeah, so so during the big, recent heat wave that we had that was only lasted about a week, that doesn't seem to have had huge effects on the kelp from what we've seen, which is good. Probably some short-term stress for the kelp, but it's these larger marine heat waves that might last. We had one between 2014 and 2016 that lasted almost 3 years, and that longer extended period of warm water can be really, really detrimental for kelp because they just can't deal with that sort of chronic stress. They like to live in these cool, nutrient-rich waters, and when you have these heat waves, the nutrients are often depleted, and it's just also too warm for them. Yeah, so this is the bull kelp, or Neufeld, and it has this big float on the top that allows it to stay upright, and that's what allows it to float up and create this three-dimensional habitat. And then these are all the blades where the bulk of the photosynthesis is happening, coming right out of that float. This we call the stipe here, which is also filled with air in this species. And let's just see if the blades are also the site of reproduction. So if I can find, it doesn't look like this individual is reproductive, but you can actually see some on the water there, that those lighter patches are reproductive sori. But basically, what's so amazing, or one of the things that's so amazing about the bull kelp, is that it's actually an annual species. So they'll start growing in about February or March, and then they'll reach these huge lengths and these huge sizes really by the summer, so just in a few months. It's a very, very impressive amount of growth that they can undergo in just a few months.
I've heard that kelp is one of those species that fixes a lot of carbon. What are researchers interested in looking at in that realm?
Yeah, so they're basically, as you said, extremely productive, so they're fixing a lot of carbon. And that raises a lot of questions about how they might be able to be part of climate change solution, basically potential solutions to climate change through carbon drawdown. So because they're rapidly growing and producing all of this, or fixing all of this carbon very, very quickly, we don't really know where all of that carbon goes, for example, when these blades break off or when there's losing sugars to the environment. But potentially, if even a certain amount of that actually stays in the ecosystem for any amount of time, that could help us reduce the amount of carbon that we have in the atmosphere by drawing it down into the ocean.
Is there sort of like a group of animals that is more indirectly dependent on kelp, like maybe not directly for habitat?
In terms of like for food?
Yeah.
Yeah, so urchins, which are a major problem for kelp forests in that when they become overpopulated, they can totally demolish and mow down kelp forests, which is something that we have seen occurring in parts of Barclay Sound for sure.
So like little lawnmowers going around and just grazing kelp?
Exactly,
oh,
yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. But they're, of course, an important part of a healthy ecosystem, and they rely on the kelp. They're eating kelp almost entirely. There are actually a whole bunch of other species that really specialize on using kelp for food and habitat. Limpets that live almost explicitly or exclusively on kelp stipes, for example. All sorts of fish that are generally associated only with kelp.
Oh,
Yeah.
neat. What would you expect to see when you're diving? I know you mentioned that there's different animals at different layers of the kelp forest. So let's say you're starting at the kelp forest at the top. If you're going down, what are some of the animals you'd see at the top?
That's a good question. So I think so in the shallows, you might imagine to see, things like forage fish, like herring, although you would rarely see them as a diver, maybe juvenile salmon using the sort of surface waters. And then as you get down, you might start to get into things like rockfish that are sort of in the mid-water column, and greenling. And then further down, you'd have things like greenling and lingcod. You'd probably have schools of kelp perch swimming around you. Yeah.
It's a really important habitat for fisheries species as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And because of that huge amount of productivity, it can actually impact other things like shellfish. So there's a lot of evidence that shellfish grow faster when they're in the presence of kelp because there's all that sugar floating around in the water that just makes the whole ecosystem more productive.
And so the sugar you're talking about, that's when the plant is growing and they're making all the leaves and little bits of leaves kind of the blades fall off?
Yeah, so there's a few things. So there's the blades themselves actually breaking, and there's that particulate matter just in the water that comes from the kelp tissue itself breaking down. But then they're also quite leaky. So about 15 to 20% of the sugar that they produce is actually just exuded right into the environment, just because as slime, right? You can feel that they're slimy, and that's actually their sugars that would be sloughing off into the environment.
Oh, interesting. So when people are walking along a beach and they see, for example, a bull kelp that's washed up, you said that this is an annual production. So that's normal. Every year you're going to see kind of bull kelp washing up on shore.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's the washing up on shore is actually a critical part of their life cycle, or an expected part of their life cycle. They alternate between these microscopic stages and then these larger macroscopic stages that we can see. And so the macroscopic stage only lives for a year, but what's called a gametophyte, the microscopic stage, can persist for longer. And what happens is they will produce these uprights in the spring. They'll grow to a large size by, say, August, September, and then when the first couple winter storms come through, they'll get ripped up. And then those microscopic stages will then produce the next crop or the next round of large upright individuals. But of course, these upright individuals are needed for dispersal and to allow the persistence of that microscopic stage, because they're dropping their spores out of those big soil patches.
Oh, wow.
So this patch here are actually the sori. So these are patches of spores, and those spores will be released and will produce that next round of gametophytes, or microscopic spores.
That's
or
so
microscopic
cool.
Individuals. And what's interesting is that, or what's very, very unique actually about Neufeld, about the bull kelp, is that you can sort of see this halo around it. So there's actually programmed cell death happening around there, and when this is ready to release spores, this whole strip will actually fall right out of the blade and sink to the bottom, and that helps to ensure that the spores actually make it down to the substrate.
Wow. So when I think sori, I think of ferns.
Yeah. So it's the same term. It's the same term, but it's quite a different structure when you see it. Yeah.
Oh my goodness. And that happens at what point in the season then?
They basically start producing them when they get pretty close to the surface, and get to be a certain size. But generally, we start to see more reproduction later in the season, so later in the summer. They actually are somewhat cued by the lunar cycle, which is pretty interesting. So they tend to become very reproductive around a full moon.
So you're collecting blades from the giant kelp species now.
Yeah. And so what we're planning to do is we're just collecting these blades, and then we're going to be doing some sequencing of their DNA to try and understand how the different populations around the area are related to each other, whether there's interbreeding or whether we're dealing with sort of a separate population that lives in a place like this that has a bit more wave action versus, a currenty area or a place that's very still. It's about 3 to 5 degrees cooler out here towards the edge of the sound than it is way down past the marine station, deeper into Barkley Sound. And so that there's potential there that these populations are adapted to those different conditions, which is one of the things we're looking at.
What sort of implications does that have for the future?
Well, we might actually be able to potentially leverage that variation in thermal tolerance or thermal resilience to try and think about restoring or conserving kelp forests in the face of climate change. So if some of these populations are better adapted to warmer conditions, we might want to use those populations in any sort of reseeding or restoration efforts.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And are those restoration efforts already underway, or is this sort of the starting of that process?
It's sort of the starting of that process. Yeah, we've just been documenting these changes in the kelp forest ecosystems around Barkley Sound and finding places where the kelp had been disappearing from, and so starting to work towards planning some of those restoration efforts.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And so specifically looking at the giant kelp species.
Both the giant kelp and the bull kelp, so the two
okay.
main canopy forming species.
Okay,
Yeah.
Gotcha. Oh, that's really cool. And so this is giant kelp here, right?
Yes, this is all giant kelp here. You can grab another one. These huge floats.
Wow,
Super
yeah.
cool.
So instead of one giant bulb, they have many little bulbs, it kind of looks like?
Exactly, yeah. So the giant kelp differs from the bull kelp in that it has several of these floats that bring the whole structure up.
Oh,
And
wow.
They're actually, they're not an annual species, so these plants could be, 3 to 10 years old, potentially. And you can see that they've got these, so these have really thick, robust, leathery almost tissue. Whereas if you went into a much more sheltered area further in, they'd be much more papery and easier to break.
So the very same species can look completely different depending on what environment it's in.
Exactly, yeah. Yeah, which we call phenotypic plasticity.
And is there sort of like a biological purpose for having all of this texture and surface area?
So there are some hypotheses that it impacts the way that water flows around it.
Huh.
There have been a few experiments, and as far as I know, they haven't really been conclusive. But yeah, so at this point, just hypotheses. Yeah.
The mysteries and beauty of nature.
Exactly, yeah.
Wow, that's really interesting. And so you're going to take all of these blade samples back to the lab, sequence their DNA,
Exactly.
and then try and understand how these different populations, or if they're related to each other.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh,
yeah.
neat.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Awesome.
Thank you.
No problem.
Thanks, Sam. We're back in the studio now to speak with Dr. Chris Neufeld, an adjunct professor at the University of British Columbia and a research scientist from right here at the Bamfield Marine Sciences Centre. Chris has a broad research background in coastal ecosystems and has done research on organisms in the intertidal zone, the area along the coast where tides rise and fall, all the way down into the subtidal zone, the area along the coasts that are always underwater. He's just recently launched the new Kelp Rescue project at BMSC, so we're looking forward to learning more about this project and the work he does to restore kelp forest ecosystems. Welcome, Chris.
Great, so happy to be here for the BCAS Climate Action Series on kelp. So I'm just going to start with a bit of background on how I got into studying kelp and kind of where this project began. So this is a picture of me and one of my lab mates. I did my PhD out of University of Alberta, and I worked out of the Bamfield Marine Sciences Centre for a large part of that. And the kind of driving question that I wanted to know about for my PhD was really how organisms responded to changing environments, both within their lifetimes, but also, over evolutionary timescales, how they evolved certain adaptations to cope with, variation in their environments. And I did most of that on rocky shores. So this is me pictured with a lab mate here on a rocky shore. And I really wasn't thinking much about kelp at that time at all. It was really just kind of something that existed in the background of my work. And there we go. And, over the years, I've been teaching students about these ecosystems for a long time. And really kelp has, for a large part of that time during my PhD and afterwards, I mostly spent time teaching students, about the value of kelp forest ecosystems as these relatively stable and incredibly common and incredibly important parts of our coastal marine ecosystems. And so, I'd spend time teaching them about the habitat that they provide for other species, the food they provide for other species that depend on them, including salmon and forage fish, commercially valuable and endangered species alike, from things like sea urchins to abalone to various other things. And all the spin-off benefits of those things on tourism and biodiversity at large. I also often teach my students about how kelp forest acts as a physical barrier in coastal ecosystems. So much of the human population lives along its coast, and having these large, robust kelp forests across about 28% of the world's coastlines really is an important part of preventing coastal erosion and also mitigating things like storm surge from hurricanes and other types of weather events as well. And then finally, these kelp forests are these large productive ecosystems right off the shore. They grow very quickly and they absorb a lot of CO2 as well. And so they have the potential, locally at least, to mitigate ocean acidification and potentially to sequester carbon that can then be transported into the deep sea and be sort of locked up in deep sea sediments over time. And so we think about kelp forests this way, and we've often described them as foundation species in these systems. And so much like the foundation of a building, they're the structural underpinning of a lot of the rest of the system. And so when that foundation gets removed, that has an impact on the whole structure as well. And that's what we started to see as I was working in these systems, and as Sam Starko and I were teaching these courses out of Bamfield. We used to take students out, and there were these very robust kelp forests, as seen here on the top panel. And over time, those kelp forests started to disappear sort of slowly. And then right around the 2014 to 2016 marine heat wave, dubbed the blob, we started to see some very rapid declines in these systems. And so that was quite alarming, given what we already know about their importance. And that was true both for these subtidal canopy kelp species like the giant kelp seen here on the left, and the bull kelp seen here on the right, and also for all the other species of intertidal kelp that we also have that Sam either has or will show you on the shore as well. And so from our initial research with a number of students from the Marine Sciences Center, we found that many intertidal kelp sites have lost more than half of their kelp species, and that's true for a wide range of sites around Barkley Sound. And this pattern that we were seeing kind of locally around the Marine Sciences Center also isn't and wasn't restricted to just that region. So this is a slide showing the studies since 2016 that have documented declines in either canopy forming or intertidal kelp species as a result of the direct effects of the 2014 to 2016 marine heat wave, or the indirect effects caused by changes to things like sea star abundance or sea urchin abundance through the spread of marine disease. And so you can see here that the scope of the impact of that marine heat wave extended all the way from Baja California all the way up at least to the central coast of BC, and some of these effects were quite widespread. And zooming out even further, it turns out that 40 to 60% of the world's kelp forests are declining. So this was a study by Thomas Wernberg and a number of authors, just showing this huge number of kelp forests around the world that are declining. And around the same time that we've started discovering these big global trends and global declines in these kelp forests, the UN just prepared for and then launched this series of important kind of ecological decades. And one of them is the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, which just launched this year. And the goal of that UN global campaign is to prevent, halt, and reverse the degradation of ecosystems worldwide through the protection and the restoration of those ecosystems. And as I mentioned, these kelp forests cover about 28% of the world's coastlines. That's 5 times more ocean than is covered by coral reefs. So they're really important globally in these systems. And when the UN launched this decade on restoration, strangely, kelp forests were notably absent from the ecosystems that they'd sort of described as being important for restoring and protecting. And that's a problem for sure, and actually has been argued by a recent paper by Colette Feehan and others that really there's a huge missed opportunity here in terms of the potential and the value of restoring kelp forests to really have some large effects on global ecosystems in the coming decade. And one of the things they outlined in this article is just that, one of the greatest challenges for the upcoming decade is this, upscaling the restoration efforts to match the extent of habitat loss. I've just shown you the extent of global habitat loss in kelp forests. So for these kinds of efforts to be successful, we need to be able to upscale these restoration efforts to match the losses. So I guess with that, with that backdrop, I'm really excited to provide a bit of a soft launch for a project that I'm just launching out of the Bamfield Marine Sciences Center. It's sort of tentatively called Kelp Rescue, though that name may change once we think about it a bit more. And the goal here is to really have it's a transformational science for solutions initiative to really scale up kelp forest restoration around Vancouver Island. So it's to use science to accelerate these restoration efforts and to ultimately restore these resilient kelp forest habitats around the island. So what does that really mean? From the science perspective, in order to come up with an effective solution for restoring kelp forests, we need to understand the key drivers of the loss. And that's been a lot of the work to date, is just figuring out why these kelp forests have been declining. The work that's been done to date points to marine heat waves as a really important driver of this loss, and not just the kind of short-term heat waves like a 2 to 4 day temperature event like the one we've just experienced, but larger heat waves that last for longer and affect the temperature of the ocean water for extended periods of time. Those heat waves can not only affect the kelp directly through the warmer water temperature, but they can also do things like make worse the recent sea star wasting syndrome outbreak on these large sunflower sea stars that has resulted in the catastrophic loss and decline of these sunflower stars, which in turn feed on sea urchins, and the sea urchins in turn feed on kelp. So once you lose these sunflower stars, the sea urchins have really ramped up in numbers, and those sea urchins have started to mow down these kelp forests in places where they have been living. The other part of the science is to really be able to predict the future conditions. So really use cutting edge climate models to say, have a better sense as to what these habitats are going to look like in 5 and 10 and 20 and 30 years. Once we know that, we can also identify stress tolerant lineages of kelp. So take kelp from places where the water might be naturally warmer and see whether those lineages of kelp, those particular populations of kelp, are better adapted to those environments and might be able to kind of withstand some warmer temperatures in the future. And then we're also going to do things like sequence genomes for both of the canopy forming kelp species, because both those are currently absent from the kind of genomic literature, and that's a really important tool for us in using these kind of modern genomic approaches to trace and understand what's happening in these kelp forests. And then from there, once we really understand the nature of the problem, the next set of efforts is to really work towards these scalable solutions. And so that is likely to be a twofold approach. The first part is to support the natural recolonization from refuge populations of kelp. So make sure that the places where kelp could grow are free of urchins. And then the second part is to really test and refine some new approaches to restoration. So I'm just going to end with just a little background on one of these restoration approaches that we're working on collaboratively with Canadian Kelp Resources, just to kind of highlight some of these approaches that we could use. So to do that, I need to back up a little bit and just very quickly present the bare bones of what a kelp life cycle looks like. So kelp are very odd creatures, and my sense is that Sam Starko has probably talked a little bit about this already. So we're probably familiar with the large, bladed kelp like you see here, that you might find washed up on a beach somewhere, that can grow up to, let's say, 50 meters long or something, 30 meters long. Within that large adult plant, which we call the sporophyte, there are these little spore patches. Within those spore patches are these tiny little microscopic spores. And what happens is those spores actually get released by the kelp. There's both male and female spores. They grow into these tiny little microscopic kind of creeping things called gametophytes. That's shown here in this picture on the right. And eventually the male and the male fertilizes the female gametophyte, and then that creates a new kind of baby kelp sporophyte that then grows up into these large things. And so why am I telling you about all this? Well, one of the most exciting approaches for developing approaches for a scalable kelp forest restoration is to figure out how to overcome some of these barriers in getting kelp back in places at a large enough scale to actually have an impact on all the things that we care about. And so traditionally, kelp have often been grown on little kind of ropes, basically, that get kind of bolted down to the seafloor, but it takes a lot of ropes, and there's all kinds of issues with bolting these things down in whale habitat and that kind of thing. And so there's a new approach that's been developed initially out of Norway, and is kind of spread globally, and we're part of this action group that's kind of developing and testing this approach in places around the globe, and it's called green gravel. And the way this works is that you take these tiny microscopic spores, which you can see sort of suspended in the solution here. You inoculate them onto pieces of gravel, and then you grow that gravel up as these baby kind of kelp seeds or kelp seedlings grow on there. And so this is kind of a very small kelp sporophyte growing on a piece of gravel in Norway. Over time, those get bigger, and eventually you can actually just take these things out, throw them off a boat. They land on the reef like this, and at first they're just attached to the gravel, and over time they're hold fast. Their kind of clinging structures actually grow down onto the gravel to attach to the rock and become the next generation of kelp forests. And so you can see that again, some slightly larger ones, and then this is an example of kind of a larger kelp sporophyte growing on a piece of gravel. Okay. That's just a very, very small piece of what some of these restoration efforts might look like, but I just wanted to use that as an example of the kinds of things that we will be doing to kind of scale up this restoration effort in the coming years globally. I guess I'll just skip that one. So the thing I want to end on is just kind of, what's the take-home message here in terms of how the public should be engaged with this stuff? What does the public need to know about kelp and kelp forest restoration? Well, the first thing is just that kelp forests are these foundational coastal ecosystems. They're not things that some people spend very much time thinking about. Some people probably just find them washed up on the beach and think, oh, those are kind of these slimy, weird things. But once you really look at their ecological role, they're incredibly important to humanity and the planet. And they're also declining really rapidly. The second thing is that they're likely unable to recover on their own. So that just the scope of the change that we're seeing in these forests means that if we just leave them to their own devices, they're not likely to recover to the scale that's going to be meaningful in terms of restoration. And the third thing is that time is really running out on this stuff. The action's needed quickly, and that's in part why we've launched this new initiative to really take advantage of the nimbleness of in some ways a startup, even though this is a it's not a business, it's a restoration effort. The idea is to be really nimble, use the best science and the best evidence to try to scale these things up quickly. So what can people actually do to be involved or contribute or think about these things? The first thing is really in some ways the most important, which is just to continue to act quickly or to act even more quickly to really deal with the ultimate source of these declines that we're seeing, which are marine heat waves, and marine heat waves are directly linked to carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And so not only prioritizing personal actions to reduce your own carbon footprint, but also to vote for candidates to prioritize this in upcoming elections, for instance. The next thing for those that live near the coast, which is probably quite a few people, or certainly people that visit the coast, is just to get to know your local kelp forest. So there's a small remnant piece of bull kelp or bull kelp forest off the tip of Stanley Park, for instance. There's kelp forests all around the Gulf Islands. There's kelp forests, as I said, 28% of the world's coastlines have these things. So try to find one, try to spend a bit of time with it. And not only will that sort of increase your own personal well-being, but it's also really gonna help you care more about these systems and understand them better. For people that go vacation in a certain spot, they might have a coastal cabin, they might go to the same place for vacation every year, and they might have been doing this for a long time. Dig through your old photos and see if you can actually find some photos that show these kelp forests in the distance in an old photo, and then go through into more recent ones and see if they're still there, and then post these things to community science platforms like iNaturalist. Send them to me. I'd love to even see them, just to kind of get a sense as to what people are seeing in their own backyards and their own neighborhoods around this stuff. And then I guess the last thing is just to not get cynical. It's really easy with the scope of what we're seeing in the world these days to kind of get cynical. And in some ways we need to do the exact opposite, is to keep being really optimistic and to see this opportunity this coming decade for ecosystem restoration, to really take the action and be part of these initiatives to actually, get where we need to go in the next 10 years. Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Chris, Patrick, and Sam for all your insights today, and a special thank you to NSERC Promo Science for the funding that made this episode possible. And of course, we wouldn't be the Climate Action Series without our climate action recommendations at the end. So first up, as Chris mentioned, spend some time in a local kelp forest. And hey, if you're inland or not near a coast, is there a forest or a special park near you that you want to spend more time in? It's good for you and it's good for the planet. Secondly, you may not realize it, but the kelp farming industry is growing like a seaweed. And kelp is found in a bunch of products you might not even know, like fertilizer, toothpaste. You can even eat it. Check out some of the startups like Cascadia Seaweed, Canadian Kelp Resources, or Sea Forest, and you can even order and snack on some kelp right at home. Finally, this Friday, September 24th, is the global climate strike. The kelp might not be able to make it there in person, but you can for them. Check out fridaysforfuture.org to see if there's a climate strike happening in your area that you can join. Our next episode is happening at the end of October, so stay tuned for that. We're going to teach you how to use iNaturalist, a community-based science platform. All right, that's it for today, folks. Thanks so much for joining us. And from all of us here on the boat, we'll see you next time.